It was a very interesting airplane to fly. It's very rudely referred to as being 50,000 rivets flying in loose formation. When you got off the flight at the end of a sort of 12-hour flight, which was a typical 12 to 15 hours, was a pretty typical sortie length.
Yeah.
And you'd get off the airplane and your whole body would be sort of shaking and vibrating. In terms of the handling qualities, you can't say it was incredibly responsive. It was slightly sort of, when you moved the control wheel, you were sort of sending signals to the ailerons, and the aircraft would eventually respond. It was very easy to fly asymmetrically. The Rolls-Royce Griffon engines were incredibly reliable and dependable, and I hardly remember any shutdowns that were forced upon us by a problem with the engine.
Yeah.
Pretty well all the flying I did asymmetrically was just for the practice to keep your hand in. There was no anti-submarine work to be done in Singapore. It was most of the work that we were doing there was partly, it was the tail end of the emergency in Malaya, and we used to drop small bombs on potential communist terrorist sites, but the main part of the work was monitoring the coastline of Singapore for illegal piracy and illegal drug trafficking and that sort of stuff.
So how long did you spend over there?
Well, I was there for a couple of years. My tour unfortunately got cut short because I got some tropical bug which I couldn't get rid of, and eventually I had to be sent back. And that must have been in oh dear me, in 1959, sometime late in 1959. Sadly, of course, while I was out there in Singapore, and I'm sort of backtracking here slightly, and I'm going back to December, just before Christmas, 1958, and that aeroplane, B for Bravo, and my crew, under the command of Stan Boutel, were scheduled to go on a detachment to Labuan in Borneo. And I didn't particularly want to go because we just got married, and my wife wasn't actually in Singapore at that time, but I was looking around for houses for us to live in and trying to get things organized for when she did get out there. And I mentioned this to one of the other pilots who'd just come onto the squadron. Funnily enough, actually, he was an ex-Sunderland pilot who'd just done the conversion onto the Shackleton. So he wanted to get some more time on the Shackleton, and he said, well, I'd love to go on that trip. So we went to see the squadron, our respective aircraft captains, and they said, well, if you want to do the swap, it's fine by us. You better just check with the squadron commander. Checked with Wing Commander McCready, and he said, yeah, that's fine. So we did this swap, and I still feel a bit uncomfortable about it to this day, I suppose, because what actually happened was that aeroplane disappeared on a patrol, and it just disappeared without trace. A massive air-sea rescue operation was mounted, and eventually one of the aircraft on this air-sea rescue hunt spotted signs of what appeared to be a grave freshly dug on a little island called Sin Kao Island, which is north of Borneo in the South China Sea. And a Royal New Zealand naval frigate was sent to the island. They sent a landing party ashore, and there they found this grave with a cross at one end of it, made out of ship's timbers, with RAF roundels painted in, B for Bravo, the code letter of the airplane, and the date. And at the foot of the grave, a Chinese rice bowl. And in the grave was the body of the flight engineer, Flight Sergeant Dancy. And he was exhumed. The cross was taken as well. put on board the frigate, and the cross and the body were then transferred to an aircraft carrier, HMS Albion, and that steamed to Singapore, and Flight Sergeant Dancy was buried with full military honours, and the cross was located in the Royal Air Force Church at Changi, and that's where it stayed until 1978.
Really?
And then when the Royal Air Force left Singapore in 1978, the cross was brought back from Singapore, and it's now, if anybody's ever in Cornwall, there's a wonderful church on the north coast of Cornwall, north of Newquay, at St Evil. It's used to be known as St Evil, I think, in the Royal Air Force, and it was a coastal command station, long since closed. St Evil is spelt E-V-A-L, and in that church, it's a wonderful sort of 13th century church. It's almost a version of St Clement Danes in Cornwall, in the West Country, and it's got a wonderful Royal Air Force Coastal Command window there, beautifully kept, and that cross to this day hangs inside the church at St Evil. So that's a very sort of special church for me. Anyway, to go back to the crash, I mentioned that Flight Sergeant Dancy was buried with full military honours. We hadn't the faintest idea what had happened. Eventually it came to the ears of the squadron commander that there was a Chinese fishing boat skipper who was talking about this aeroplane that had crashed right by his fishing boat. And he went to interview this fishing boat skipper, gave him a model of a Shackleton, said, "Show me what happened." And he showed the airplane doing several flypasts. And they had on board, by the way, the Assistant Commissioner of Police for Borneo.
Okay.
And it was all to do with anti-piracy, anti-smuggling. And they were obviously checking this fishing boat out to see if it was doing legal things or illegal things. And on its final flypast, the fishing boat skipper showed this model just suddenly sort of changing attitude completely and diving into the water. And it just sunk without trace, the whole thing. And this one body was thrown out and left floating on the surface. And that was Flight Sergeant Dancy. And they did all the correct things and gave him a decent burial, which was fantastic. And that fishing boat skipper, by the way, got a reward from HM government for, doing all the correct and right and proper things. We will never know what happened. I think the squadron view was that this aeroplane, the Mark I version of the Shackleton in those days, the fuel cocks were mounted on a bulkhead underneath and behind the captain's seat, which was in a sort of the flight deck, if you like, was somewhat elevated by comparison with the rest of the fuselage behind, and there was a bulkhead there behind the captain's seat. And on that bulkhead were the master fuel cocks, which were up for on and down for off.
Right.
And they had no guard on them. And the speculation is that this Assistant Commissioner of Police was leaning between the two pilots' seats, looking out at this fishing boat, and that he inadvertently had his hand on those fuel cocks and pushed them all four down. And that would account for this sudden change in attitude. Suddenly you've got no fuel going to these four Rolls-Royce engines with their contra-rotating propellers. It would have been like a massive air brake in the sky, and they would have had not a chance. They were at about 150 feet, something like that, above the water, and the airplane just went straight into the water. I mean, if it had happened at 10,000 feet, they'd have relit the engines. At that height, they stood not one single chance. That's pure speculation, but that I know is what the squadron felt, and all I can say is that subsequent to that, a guard was fitted over those fuel cocks so that couldn't happen again.
I see, yes. Very sad story.
So it was a very sad story, and you know, I've always to this day had a sort of slight sense of guilt.
Yeah.
But there you are, fate is a fickle old mistress, and I've been very lucky in my flying life, and for some reason or another, fate has always spared me. So